So, I'm going to be making coffee. This is going to be a little bit of a longer one. Give me a second. I need to update people, if they ever watch this stuff, on this idea that I have of a linear accelerator. Because there was a individual on YouTube came up on my feed talking about how ChatGPT would like to run a fissile material nuclear reactor, and they went with the breeding thing, the fusion thing, and then a uranium, I forget what it is. The point is, it's like, that's ChatGPT though. And I'm not really a nuclear physicist, so caveat, or any of these other things, so caveat here. But these things are not impossible to understand, and I never really found them to be very difficult to understand after I hit a certain point of knowing about what it is that it effectively is. So, let's see here. I want to talk about these linear accelerator designs that I happen to have, in my head. I'm not very good at writing things down. I'm not very good at drawing. I'm not very good at a lot of that stuff, and I have to get into it. Right. But I am very good at imagining these things, and so far, so good on how it is that they've come out with various studies, apparently, of either people thinking very similar to me, or some connectives, some entangle, I don't care, in terms of quantum physics and blah, blah, blah stuff. Moving on. So these linear accelerators are not a standard linear accelerator. They are, imagine, if you will, just take a chill pill, as like a 3D printer, okay? Right, but there are a bunch of branches that all go down into one singular solitary exit. Alright, now, they are going to be what is the equivalent of a bunch of linear accelerators that have very high luminosity, that have very specific designs to remove electrons, push in more electrons, meaning ionic or plasma, basic alkalines, or whatever. Alright, that's the general gist of it. Then they have an area where they combine, and then there's another area of plasma, lasers, electrostatic and or electromagnetic fields there, to create what is essentially a version of a redirect of the outward cone flow into a specifically directed laser almost. It's not really a laser, it's more like a light that's been focused like a lens. Okay? Alright, now, as a result of that, we'll have, as it's running through, a degree of this fusion. But we're not doing regular fusion, okay? Like, this is, you can either make it as a 3D printer, okay, meaning you can force bonding pairs that normally would never force themselves together, or, and we're talking nanoscales for these linear accelerators, to fusional scales for atoms. Okay, so we're going to have what is the equivalent, it's my dog plays with something in the bathroom, of a corrected entanglement up and down wave, meaning the wave function that is in there is going to be trying to be entangled until it gets to the very end, and it should very much be entangled. Then we're going to jump it into a superposition with standard lasers, effectively, and some fields. Boom. And it doesn't matter that it won't last. We don't want it to last. That's irrelevant. We don't even want the entanglement to last, because they're going to hit each other. We want them to get really close in, and then the entanglement and superposition allows for a quantum tunnel to cause fusion. Okay, big fusion, you get neutrons. Now, see, this is where the plasma and all the rest of it, neutron capture, effectively, is what this is going to be. Although it's not a neutron capture, but those lasers and plasma, electromagnetic, electrostatic, destructive fields, okay, which create a degree of pressure, a weakly interacting pressure field, which does actually work to interact with, interfere with, basically just mostly neutrons. It's a neutron field. Now, some of this is already known to exist. These are usually very high level physics experiments that we're talking about that we know do this. The reason why I was thinking about it is because they were like, well, we'll use like this fuse blah 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 for thorium, and I was like, that's a really just get a bunch of nickel and lead and shit, and then make what is effectively a bunch of these, nozzle cones. Okay, nozzle cones are the equivalent of, okay, so we have a cone, a parabolic cone, and there's going to be effectively a bunch of those little cones, more or less, that are the wavy shape, kind of like a Velcro, but what that means is it has a way for the neutrons to reflect back inwards, and once they get to that certain point, they spread out and are more likely to be bounced into concentrated areas, meaning reflected in this instance, into those given areas. But then we have the laser and electrostatic, electromagnetic, destructively interfered fields. We need them to be there, so that way we capture more and we have an extended effect versus the density. So it's like these are layered, dense materials that have this effect being done specifically to concentrate things. That's what that will be for me, what I would do. But it's like, this is for fucking thorium fissile. I'm just using this fusion ball. It's like, well, I'll capture it. That fucking fusion ball's massive amount of neutron release. Just fucking concentrate that. And it's like, that's basically all I'm gonna do. Because like, fuck all the rest of it. This is an easy brute force. Electrostatics and electromagnetics don't need to be extraordinarily high energy. And reflective material is only needing to be material that's dense. Right? Basic stuff. So it's like, that's a way to basically make a fissile thorium reactor, which essentially is a ball, which looks an awful lot like a COVID virus, because it's a ball with spikes and then all this other fucking shit that goes towards the center, which is the actual reactor. Okay, so it's effectively what it is. Then I was like, right, but I already talked about this while I was showering, and so there was that nobody really ever watched. And so I was like, all right, so let's make a basic design that maybe people can understand. So it's like, think logic gate branching from one. And so it's like, what's this question? Yes, no, maybe, but these things. So yes or no, and then maybe, but these things, no, yes, that kind of thing. Logic thinking, you know what I mean? Basic programming stuff. So it's like, well, amazingly, works just the same. Works just the same for like fucking, linear accelerators pointed at each other with the right quantum tunnel maybes, and I could possibly, but these things, and then fusion, and then some neutrons too. Because it was like, well, that's easy enough, right? That's fusion, right? And it's like, the problem is it's a very, 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 very low energy, extraordinarily high energy output fusion. Low energy input, very high energy output. You still want them to be warm, but it can start at, room temperature for these atoms. Now, that's all that is. They're accelerators. They're atoms that we're accelerating, in this case hydrogen. You know what I mean? And they can run off regular hydrogen. They don't need like regular, tritiums and deuteriums. Irrelevant in terms of that. Like, you don't. That's how energy efficient this is. But that's the reason why it's like, when you think laser grid arrays and all this, it's just gobbledygook science speak. And I'm like, for layman's people that want to understand what the hell it is I'm saying, this makes sense. But for like, if you're a scientist that actually needs to like, what is it that is just destructive interference cross channels? Or it's like that energy has to go somewhere, and it's like, that's correct. It creates pressurized fields, outward bound 360 pressurized fields. Now these fields aren't normal fields, they dissipate quite quickly into heat. But not just heat, they also create this thing called quantum vacuum pressure fields, effectively. You know what I mean? It's either light, vacuum pressure, quantum vacuum pressures, or weakly interacting fields that are perfectly suited for neutrons, because they're neutral. They don't have a positive, they don't have a negative, they don't have any of that. So they're neutral fields that are extraordinarily, profoundly strong at being able to interact with neutrons. So, as a result of that, though, you have to do it the right way with the right fields that you're destructively interfering, which means the lasers, the plasmas, and the electromagnetic, and the electrostatic, all combined together to equal one really strong amplified field. Because you put multiples together to make that effect occur. And you oscillate it. So it's like, let's say it's a pulse, like a click like this, and you have another one that's the right way, and another one that's the right way, and it's constructive interference neutral fields that are pressure fields. Okay? That's what that is. Alright? Which gives you a greater degree of interactive forces on which are not interfering in any way, they're interacting. So interacting means they're constructively making something occur. They bleed speed. They'll take energy from a neutron's kinetic and cool it, but then redirect it. So that's what the standard model, quantum standard model effects, mathematically speaking, are going to be if you do the math. All right. That's why that works. Now, we're almost to the end, because it's like there's a whole bunch of those that then go into whatever output in terms of helium, not hydrogen, whatever. Doesn't really matter. Honestly, it's however much of that you get, because that plasma and all the rest of it, that has to go into creating, because you have to have fairly high heat plasma to make this work, which is another reason why it's like, well, you have to cool that. Some of it's not going to fully go through, and some of it's going to absorb some of those neutrons. You know what I mean? So it's like, that allows for you to gain back some of that heat and then put it back into the next accelerator area. Now, you can't make it run off of itself without a large amount of capture and a large amount of efficiency increases. And then that turns into its own version of a capacitor dump, like an electron flow capacitor dump that dumps into the next accelerator energy area that you need to dump it into, which can eventually, theoretically speaking, because you're making what is a version of exothermics be created that ultimately gets captured very efficiently and then turned into electricity. Now, depending on how efficient you get that, you might be able to have that second area covered by the first. Maybe. It depends on its size and the size that you have at the first. So it's one of those things. But I'm not trying to sell you on that. I'm trying to sell you that it makes it more efficient, and then we can dump energy from outside sources into the given accelerator matricity. Now, the reason why I came up with this was because I wanted to make, you know how graphite has a little let's imagine that this circle here is a hexagon. Imagine that. And can you imagine with your brain? Do you have the capacity to get non-pedantic about it? And then there's an atom right there in the center, right? Of carbon, right? Now, imagine, if you will, there's a bunch of curves towards that circle and a bunch of other curves within inside of that, and then we create a bunch of different versions of that. Imagine the entire circle's space and around it is filled with very, very, very different, but also very dense atoms. Okay, so fissile styles of material, but not just regular fissile. We have specific alpha, beta, so on decays that we need to have squish our nucleus fields, but then drain that energy into electron orbital increase fields. So there's like but they're trapped in their current state. Imagine them as being not, instead of pairs of electrons that are superconducting. We're not thinking about that. Okay, they get trapped in their respective fields at this energy level, and they can't really move much because there just isn't enough space. Well, that was the point of the linear accelerator thing that I made. It's, instead of making a bunch of chemical reactions for bonds, we're not doing bonds, we're making a bunch of graphite style or graphene 2D sheets that are curved into a massive, superly hyper dense material that has these nuclear, not neutron, fields that are basically inside of each other. And they're, on a technicality, not. And on a technicality, they are, which is no longer superposition, because, they can't be superpositioned. So they're always dropping out, but then they act like they're going to be. And they'll never fuse, okay? They'll never fissile, because the decay goes into making the structure itself support it that way. And separating orbital fields. Now, if you were to look at the structure very closely, you'd see that they are still very uncertain, but they're a lot easier because they're very, very narrow now. Instead of a sphere, they're much more narrowly made, effectively. You can't find, from our detectors and sensor data, where it is. But that doesn't matter to it, because it knows, quantumly, relatively speaking, where the electron is going to be, because it creates a plug of pressure forward and a rearward pressure of where it once was. Quantum informational pressure, blah, 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 whole bunch of blah, blah, blah for quantum physicists out there to deal with wave functions and jiggles and wiggles inside of the fluid matrix that are us stuffs. Okay, which is what it is, all right? There's a bunch of layman's and simple, and it sounds stupid way of saying, give up, you other physicists. This isn't quite the same. These are other physics now that you need to get into to be able to know what this is. Anyways. Now, the reason why I made this specifically was to have a very high reflective neutron material. Alright, if I design it the right way, those neutrons actually get reflected and then go into a nucleus's increase or decrease of its jiggle, effectively. Kinetic. Right? Now, then some of them are immediately within a few microns, micrometers at most, reflected back out. The rest are absorbed into heat. Now, this was for space-faring vehicles, because they're extraordinarily hyper-dense. Like, so dense, even though they're not, going to break the bonds of, the electron orbital fields, and not going to, we're not getting to Schwarzschild limits or anything like that. Nothing like that's going on. But, because they're connected together in a very strong lattice structure that's super, super dense, and they have to literally squeeze against each other, they are the densest, non-compressed material that you can make. Literally. That's what I designed it for. But it was like, well, if I do this in a similar manner for the thorium here, I'm able to get away with something similar but different. So now, if I do it with thorium, which this one's just another version of the branching structures that go into those little sheets that get made, and then they deposit like a nozzle onto a substrate, and then you get a rod, or a big sphere or whatever it is that you want to have and be there. With the correct balancing, in this instance, of absorptive neutron materials, so that way it never fully overheats, much safer as a thorium. Built-in stuff. But then you're able to cool it by simply having water flow through a given structure, like a radiator that's just built like that, to allow for water to flow over and still ultimately capture the heat energy, which they usually turn into steam. Personally, I tend to not. My designs usually turn into, this is a waste heat generator with the piezoelectrics. We'll flow water through on the inside, the heat will create a thermoacoustic, and then we'll use the piezoelectrics heating and cooling strain into air, or in this instance, because I was using it as a way of creating a generator, a backup generator specifically, that I'd have to combine multiples of these pieces together to create enough of a actual energy, meaning heat increase, that I could then dump onto IR energy. That way I could have it for a space generator. Much less weight, because it's 90% efficient now, because piezoelectrics are 90% on average efficient for capturing mechanical stress and strain, and it's still got to cool it, so it's like, well, IR. You know what I mean? Which then turned into, well, guess what? Those are IR emittance on one side, and then a fucking IR photovoltaic dumping it into that, which still allowed for a degree of efficiency increase for my generator in space, because I already have like a version of this linear accelerator, recirculator design for, basically as it accelerates, it creates a degree of that wiggle and jiggle from backwards and forwards and up and down and side to side, helping create entanglement profiles in the plasma of hydrogen that we use. Now, that then gets hit together as a double helix, so down and down, but then it also happens to have a degree separated at the top that creates a degree of fusional pressure, and then there's a big hole right there. So this fuses, hole, and then it gets grabbed and accelerated down into a tube as it does it again. And then eventually it goes out to the bell end, having created much greater amounts of mass, higher heat. Heat gets turned into a degree of pressure as it gets cooled off by colder plasma to help create more fusion. Then we use a reflective IR, radio wave, electromagnetic and electrostatic kind of railgun, coil gun tech in the bell end, using a aerospike and then a bell end around that, which then grabs it and accelerates it with a little bit of electrodes for the stators that you have to have there, to then allow for that to drop out as being no longer a plasma, then you have to cool it with plasma. You get the picture on that one. Goes out near the speed of light, typically high 99%, while very, very captured and accelerated. So mass and acceleration equals force, equal opposite. You get the picture, very efficient. I can capture some of it utilizing a degree of electromagnetic interference and electromagnetic and electrostatic fields, while shining light forward to redirect it to then capture it more evenly, and as a result then transport it using another version of quantum tunnel entanglement and superpositional effects in a linear accelerator to then have it dump off into, that's right, this thing called the intergalactic engine. It's a Lemke engine. It's intergalactic because, well, the faster you go, apparently there's a possibility of increasing the likelihood chance of gaining negative and other exotic energies through the quantum tunnel, sending it through as an extra, more or less. And we capture it using standard electrostatic, electromagnetic, some lasers, and then now you know why the generator is a thing that we use, but we still capture some of that heat because we have to cool it off into the cabin. So I wanted to create a constant never-ending 1G acceleration, so I didn't have to fuck around with quantum gravity or anti-gravity or any of that BS. So that was really hard to deal with, because it's like, well, you said there were gravitons. All I'm seeing is a field that ultimately manages to interact with itself, slow itself down so it's less as fast as, like, oh, I don't know, this thing called light. because it curves itself in towards itself. So thanks. And oh, by the way, because it curves itself in towards itself, it acts an awful lot like in your fucking mathematics, as if it's a goddamn particle called a graviton. So it's like the opposite of a light particle, where it's more particle, then it turns into a wave, whereas this is more wave, then it turns itself into a particle in certain aspects, which is just annoying. So it's like, I can't capture that, so I'm just fucking leaving it. I don't care. Especially when it's quantum versions of space compression, which really just means it harmonically, in an aspect, a perspective here, harmonically and resonatively, for all the little wiggles and jiggles of all of our stuffs that are inside of us, slows down the expansion of this stuff called quantum vacuum pressure. And so curvature becomes more pronounced, because we're still experiencing inflation. So as inflation curves around us, we gain what is essentially a closeness, no longer as much space, to us. And the larger the effect, the greater and more pronounced it is. That's also why it happens to look like gravity. That's my version of quantum physics, okay? That's why. Alright? I happen to believe the things I do, because it means you can go backwards and forwards in terms of time here, but only so much. Okay, so put it this way. You can view it, you can know what's there, has been and will be, much like the time little machines that you have, like they had the little radar and it jiggles some fucking stupid atom or whatever, and it can get sent backwards and forwards. They talked about them back around the 2001 or some other area, back then era, you know what I mean? And it's like, that's the 2000s era, and it's like, right, but as long as it was on, it gives you a degree of time machine-like capacity, right? Except you can't move anything backwards. You can't move, you can move information, which can then be extrapolated, but you can't move it with like actual physical things, like mass and particles and so on. So you can't do any of that. None of that exists. But information does. And like using that, I was able to gain this as a degree of physics understanding. Which is the reason why it's like, it already exists. Suck it up. Gravity is literally just information bullshit. It's a version. It's not information. Just so you know. It's just like, it's similar. You know what I mean? Like the math, like when you try and do Bernoulli's and Ventruli's, you're like, it's a vacuum, it's a faster, blah, 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 and then you realize it's like, this is basically the same fucking equation. It's two different perspectives on different stuff. You know what I mean? And like, that's basically what it is. But they're mine, Lemke, physics, concepts, and theories, and hypotheses. So it's like, instead of using that, which is like, wave functions still exist, right? And it's like, well, it depends. For the person that is the thing, like we can self-examine. We know what's going on in our head and shit. If you went really, really hard, you can get into someone else's head. And you can really, from an outside perspective, get really good at determining their body language, their affect, and all the rest of it, for a mood, and what they might be thinking, and where they might go for decisions. And we already have that predictive analysis, right? That's pretty dang good. Same thing. Kind of the same thing, you know what I mean? Like, eventually you can get to a point where you can have an exacting precision, but then everything else went away. I liken it to, like, look at your thumb, and then look behind you. Do you see the fact that behind you, when you look at your thumb, has turned into a double, and it's blurry? That's what that will be. It's like, oh, you can look at that, but then everything else is now uncertain. Literally, boom. You get it. You know what I mean? Which is still, that part's now uncertain, but this part sure as fuck isn't. Except you know that you'll go into that, and you're a part of that part. So it's like, the whole brain observation, looking at them, and then that. Same thing, basically. Which they're like, no, my physics, and I'm like, you still think 9 an infinite amount of times before 1 is 1. Just because you didn't like having to do the math of an infinity. I still hate you for this. It's like, no, a 1 is 1. It's a 1. I don't give a fuck. Then you lied about like going, 1, 0 times 1 or whatever, this, it can't be changed. And it's like, It doesn't do anything. It's zero. It's a literal nothing. Why can't it be changed? Why does it do anything? Why does it make it go be a negative as a constructive, in no way interference, instead now destructive interference? Why is it like this? Why did you make zero a destructive interference in your math? Where it cancels all things out. Because it's infinite? Fuck off. Stop that. It shouldn't exist in anything at all in your capacities for mathematics. But no. 9 repeated infinitely is suddenly going to be a 1. It'll just tip over to 1. No, it doesn't. You just can't program it to do an infinite number of 9s. Which annoys me, because it's like, it's not 1. I know you say it's 1, but we all know it's just an infinite number of 9s. And in one hand, it's technically bigger, but it'll never equal 1. It'll just go on forever. That's literally how the math works. That one's a real, actual, very strong trigger for me. I have to say that. Just so you know. I'm still pissed at the math community for this. Because I saw someone doing 1 is approximately equal to 9 repeatedly. And I was like, that's exactly the only fucking way to put that. That is the only thing it is. It's approximately equal. It is never equal, ever, at all, forever. Pedantic natures matter. In this fucking context. You should stop doing that, you stupid mathematicians. You say that you're in any way like an engineer at all. Not at all variety. And then you go, ooh, but 1 and 9 repeated infinitely is the same. Fuck off. Zoom in and enhance your little mind imagination to the line. It never hit it. It will never hit. Ever. But no. There's a point where it's like, you're saying that we're infinite. Get over it. You can make infinite data sets easily. Shut the fuck up about not being infinite. Just because you want to live in a little sphere bubble, alright, where it's like all this can be calculated for, but what about that outside? No, it's not a thing. It's all finite. Fuck off. Super duper shut the hell up. You are not right. In every way, you are wrong. Within a given area, you can determine a lot, but you can never determine the size and scope of an actual infinity unless you are an infinity yourself. That's how that works. Alright? Which always bothers me. Like, math people start bothering me when they act like an engineer, as they call it, when in reality they're not. Worse, it's like there's a lot of fucking work. And I've talked about this, where you need to account for as many variables as possible in science and engineering and technology and all the rest of it. And then they stop doing it once they actually start doing work, seems like. And it's like, no, that's not true. And it's like, yes, you do. Yes, you fucking do. None of you determine in any way all the different things in your fucking sensor and or data detector that you want. Data collector, by the way. Detector and data collector. So it's like, you know what I mean? But they don't. They don't ever think about the voltage noise that's going on between that line into the very thing that detects it. You know, the voltage or decrease or jump, whatever it is that they're trying to figure out. And so it's like, no. When we're talking about subatomics, quantum physics, it means a massive amount of deals. Okay? It's a huge thing. Like, you have to do that. And they don't. You know what I mean? And so, I don't know. Like, I get really pissed off, and then mathematicians are like, it should be fine. It's close enough. And I'm like, it's not! It's not accurate at all. Shut the fuck up. It's not. I hate them. You know what I mean? Like, for real. Because it's like, it's not accurate enough. Ever. Like that. Like, you actually have to account for that. Anyways, we're moving on. Because it's like, look, that's gone on for too long. The reason why you don't do this fusion very much in like a toroidal like a double toroidal into like a shaft with a linear decelerator that then allows for you to then capture a lot of that energy and then put it back in, which is, I like to call it like the dick, a phallus, because it's two ball donut shapes and then a shaft. So, and then I usually have to bleed out the energy into a hole of some kind. So I call it the penis, but it's like, for what it's worth, it's not as efficient as my cone design, which starts very large, which has this, and then it goes, which is really more of a this, and then it goes, fires in, and then has its own version of a out and then back in, and then we have a recirculating central shaft that then eventually builds up pressure until it goes to the nozzle, and then we have enough pressure with the heat of the plasmas that then squeeze into the nozzle and then tend to try and capture some of that heat energy from colder with colder plasma, and then turn that into its own degree of fusion, which then bleeds out into the bell end. All right, which then allows for the acceleration. And I usually, on average, get a mostly iron with a plus or minus of about, in terms of plus, we're talking about 2 to 3, above iron, and then down to about 5 below. All right, because that's the nozzle, like the plasma injection, which tends to create that, problem, more or less. Anyways, it causes it to spin with that, and then it goes in, it compresses, and then it also causes a reverberation, oscillation. So as it spins, it goes out, and then in, then out, and then in. Then we have another nozzle that's right there. As it goes in, it then fires it in, both from the outside, opposing effectively towards its direction of trying to go out, and then that creates its own version with a nice little electromagnetic and laser grid array, electrostatic, that stuff. Basically it's like that stuff, but it's like, right, there's fields in the plasma, there's electrostatic fields in the plasma. You have to like both add and then subtract to create a donut ring, toroidal ring that's spinning and rotating, and it captures that, and then it goes out, and then some of it bleeds out around the electrostatic, creates a degree of pressure, all right, and heat, which then also allows for that nozzle to vibrate, and goes out and in, and you can do it different ways. Personally, I do from that inside, then out, and what that does is a certain amount will hit the bell end, and then cone up, so it goes like a circle, and then we have a bell end like that tends to fire it in one direction, which is very efficient for what it's worth, because it allows for us to dynamically change how much acceleration and how much deceleration we want, meaning like deceleration and captured for more energy, more efficiency, but then meaning more clean to iron, meaning less than 5, now it's like a 1 or 2, right, which is more efficient, but then we don't have as much acceleration of that mass, versus like we allow for more mass to be accelerated, so we have more mass. You get the picture. Anyways, point is, that was the reason why I did it, because it's like, well, quantum tunnelly speaking, if I'm able to capture some of that from the skin on the outside, then I have this really dense material in between, just in case it doesn't, then it's like, right, well then that one allows for me to reflect it back into that, like the reflector constructive destructive interference for the designs I had for, and still have, for photovoltaics. So photovoltaics takes whatever light's there, reflects it with a little bit of amplification, energy, but compounds. So like night vision goggle compounds. They'll take whatever IR is in, and then they'll bring it out to like green wavelengths, right? Well, similar design for photovoltaics. There's a degree of loss, but then what we do is we ultimately get more as a result of more being concentrated into and constructively interfered with and destructively interfered with, because like we're destroying certain to make the IR or other various wavelengths that we want to capture. We tend to have to cool it, but then we use I need an electron coolant, very acidic based coolant. Or in some instances, we have the opposite, where I have too many electrons. And so what that means is it creates movement, and it'll try and grab an electron. So like, as that is of course going to wiggle, and so we have to create, which is, wiggles mean electromagnetic interference, you know, or radiation. Anyways, it vibrates the fucking shit and makes an electron, more or less. That's how I view it. All right, so like that's how I view that. So the photovoltaic vibrates, creates electron, you know, that kind of thing. That's how I view that, because that's quantum physics, you know, right? So anyways, throw that out there. Then it's like, right, but that's, well, cool, okay, really cool. I also don't really care that much about it, because I just need it to resonate at that max peak frequency that it's going to do that at. So it's like, I'll have that constructive interference and destructive interference, so that way it massively increases the output to its max potential. But then it's like, I'll take some of that heat that it has to generate doing that into the coolant substrate, which also helps with that electron movement. All right, which acts like a super turbo. So it's like we're creating a supercharger using the constructive and destructive interference, but then we're trying to limit using what is the equivalent of lubricant with our reflective and light amplifying compounds and constructive and destructive interferences. Then it's the turbo, which is the, depending on how it is you want to do it, with a more electrons or less electrons liquid that then has to be phase changed, or in my instance, I don't do a phase change, I just pump it into using usually thermosiphons, but then you don't really always need to do thermosiphons for what it's worth. But basically it's a version of the waste heat generator I was talking about with the now Joule-Thomson heat exchanger cycle with the thermoacoustic. So like this will already produce a thermoacoustic for what it's worth because of the heat and cooling. And then that creates that vibration, which allows for it to remove some bubbles, which then goes off, and then they'll be condensed, but then they're still hotter. And so that allows for a separation, you know, from hotter and cold sides, and that creates a pump, a thermosiphon pump. But then it's like, but then as long as I have that slightly lower, it then uses that pressure, and then eventually that's its own degree of energy, right, that it's going to put into it. Now granted, I tend to just have a pump, no matter what. I literally, it's like whatever low energy pump ultimately makes this work better and faster is good enough. Just so anybody's clear on why I do that, it's because that's a way out of this idea that I need a certain thermal amount to make it work. Like it's out. It now works on the cold side, now works on the hot side, and now works wherever. It could be upside down, whatever. It doesn't matter. As long as the pump's on. It'll still work without the pump, but it's like the pump can still be something that works for this. You know what I mean? So like that's the reason why I tend to do that, because it's far more efficient as a result. Like even a small amount of that waste heat, which is like the piezoelectrics are usually around that 90%, right? And then a little bit of that convection and conduction, which then turns into the nice little bumps and channels and grooves, which create vortexes as they go and get split. So a vortex then gets split in between another vortex, and then that creates its own degree of vortex. And so it's like they actually get denser from the initial splits that create vortex, and then they diffuse back in at the rear, creating a greater degree of surface area, boundary layer reduction effects that allow for more cooling as they rotate and then ultimately move those molecules, air molecules, and atoms out and then allow them to diffuse. So it'll look like it has a very high amount of fin density, but it goes through like it doesn't. And that's all because of how it diffuses. So it starts fairly small, and then it gets wider, and it goes back to slightly smaller, you know, but not as small as the entrance. That way it allows for this effect to occur much more easily and readily. Alright? And it doesn't seem to feel like I have a massive amount of fin density that I can't do. You know what I mean? Like that's a really bad way of getting around that boundary layer problem, because that means I have to have a lot more higher static pressure This way, it's like, no, I don't need higher static pressure. I'm going to use a Joule-Thomson larger to smaller heat exchanger effect that goes back to larger because saturation. And it's like, and then that larger is from the outside. So it's like we take a little bit of a fan shroud around the outside of the entrance for those little, vortex inducers that are heading in, and then like that's a little collector that then just dumps it into the outside because it's saturated. And so like that allows for another degree of pressure to still be there, and then dump it into the rear that removes some of the saturation, increasing our cooling capabilities. Because we'll saturate heat depending on its given need for cooling. It's like, let's say I only had like 150, but I had the basic shroud for that. It's like all of a sudden from 150 I've got like effectively 200 plus watts of cooling. You know what I mean? Which is good. That's a really big design, upgrade. But the reason why a lot of people don't do it is because it's like, well, that's annoying to have to manufacture. I'm like, no, it's not. Just fucking bend your fins right, you stupid clods. Weirdos. I don't want to do work. And this is the problem I have with math, the engineers, manufacturers, so many people. So it's like, I just, so angry sometimes. It's like, this is how easy this is. Like, legitimately, that's how easy that is. We already know that these work that way. We already know these designs, like this concept design that I have. We already know physics, engineering, and all the rest of it. We already have all of them that work exactly like I'm saying. This is just sticking the pieces together to make the most out of it that we already have. We don't need to get tricky with materials until we get into the space stuff. We don't need to get tricky with even the quantum entanglement. Quantum tunnel is what we're talking about. Quantum tunnel fusion, which is really how quantum tunnel fusion works, but it's like we're using acceleration to create the version of gravity, and then we're going to use entanglement to massively, with that superposition, increase with the higher degrees of luminosity the amount of fusion we get out. And the amount of fusion energy that we capture. Now, the reason why I was talking about the toroidal, it's dangerous. Like, if you do that towards that little spike wave to the little shaft that you have to have, which I know, it's like, no, you don't have to have a shaft. It's a big room. Let's go with room. I was like, oh, sure, yeah, no, right. We'll go with room. We'll go with room, okay? Yeah. We will never tell them it's the penis fucking generator. The public must never know. You know what I mean? But it's like, right, and then you have a fucking coupler. Yeah, oh yeah, no, that one's for real though. It's like, that's what they'll call it. Versus me, who's like, it's a fucking hole that you insert the shaft into. Okay? And then it bleeds off heat and pressure. And then you basically percolate that through a bunch of little holes that are covered by water. Yeah, it's a radiator hole, effectively. It's like, this is my reservoir. It goes through, it warms and then creates steam, and then goes back in with helium as we separate different densities of hydrogens and heliums, and then we take the heliums out, and then we put it into shaft for Cooley properties, and then eventually we must exchange the helium into something. So we'll just take that heat, we'll heat it up using IR, microwave, all this stuff, and then we'll blast it into the balls, the toroidals. They will be supercharged with meaty power. We will fire in the cold, very obviously much colder helium than this. It will then match equilibrium after a certain amount of spins through the toroidals. Then we will start the process of fusing helium as we recirculate the design many times until eventually, hopefully, you hit there's too much damn energy that we have to add in. You know what I mean? When it comes down to space, that's fine. The energy is mass being accelerated. That's how our thrust works. And if we end up getting that exotic material, then we'll start having a degree of flame, as I like to call it, that is expanded space and time behind us. We're not compressing anything in front of us, except we're sucking that in with the light that's moving forward. And so we'll have a degree of light that's in front of us as space and time curves as the faster we go, helping increase the degree of captured hydrogens and possible, exotic material / energy. You know what I mean? Which is a good thing. Now, see, the quantum tunnel thing is what they usually don't like about it, but I'm like, right, but that's just entanglement and superpositioning and then taking a certain amount of energy to tunnel things, which is like, oh no, I did a whole other bare minimum wormhole tunnel thing. Let me just tell you about this. We're actually going to use electromagnetics now and some lasers. Before it was just like, I don't need any of that practically. I just need like a spinning, vortex static charge, vortex field, static charge field. So it's like they'll spin while they have that field, and then they'll pulse the right way, and then that will spin too inside of a tube that has a main given cycloidal static charge, and then we'll bump in lasers in certain areas that cross and destructively interfere, which will act with the pressure in the given static charge that is there as if it's like a nuclear and or electron, charge field basically for that. And then eventually you create a bed of those that then become, when you jiggle it the right way with the lasers and everything, going on, which no electromagnetics have occurred so far, right? Then it turns into like, all right, and then this, which basically can be whatever that is. You just jiggle, like this is, let's say they were electrons. Let's go with electrons. They're all negative charge, blah, blah, blah stuff. And it's like, this is a bunch of electrons that are fairly close. They can't be that close, but like they're jiggling at the right amount. Like now we're entangling. And then we're going to, boop, superposition, dunk. Now we have electrons. You know what I mean? They'll tunnel. It's like, well, no, we're going to shove electrons in those areas where you thought those electrons were going to be. So, like, they can't go back that way. So now they're like, well, this is a place that already exists. So I suppose I could try and go there. Boom. Done. You know what I mean? It's a tunnel version of a wormhole. You know what I mean? And then it was like, well, if I just add electromagnetics, this is far fucking faster and easier. So if I create the right downward and then sideways and then in and out, which is like, no offense to any and all people out there, I can understand why this is going to annoy you. It's like a vagina, like a vaginal canal, okay? It's like the muscular structure of that. And a throat, okay? With the degree of electrostatics that are spinning and everything. Okay, right. Yeah. So it's like that, where it's got that shaft area, which is pulsating in and out and up and down. And then, that's the destructive, but then it's like you only need to destruct it where those lasers are going to be, which creates a degree of electromagnetic, electrostatic charge differences that we can interfere with the laser light that we have, which those photons are in every way not going to be where the actual entangled bit is, okay? Like, we call them bits now because it's like it's a bit of something. It's a bit of something. But it's just fields, it's pressures, effectively. You know what I mean? And it's like, and now it will be entangled with something else that has and is the real equivalent. Is that this is just mimicking, and it's not an equivalent. It's like the moment you remove all the energy that's going into this, and it doesn't need to be a lot, but like a decent amount is being involved. Like you need to have an actual structure to make this exist, that's built for it. Whereas this, it's like, well, I can just keep electrons in like a fucking goddamn copper fucking cable, DC current running back and forth, and then that's an entanglement, right? So it's like that kind of thing that allows for you to just dump it over into here, which is long range wireless energy transmission, but it's really quantum tunnel transmission. And it's like, they don't need to be cold, which is great. You don't need it cold anymore, which is wonderful. I know people will be like, you do. And it's like, no, you don't. You don't even need to worry about interference. Like, there's nothing in there other than interference, practically. Like, we're interfering it the right way and constructively interfering it the right way. So destructive and constructive to make our own version of an anechoic chamber that creates this own version of movement of these mimicked like particles. They're virtual particles now to atoms. All right. And it's like, that's the laser grid array that has to be like that, which is a fairly complex design, but not as bad as like some others. You know, like, hey, I need to take exawatts and then make a tiny little atom-sized quantum, wormhole. And it's like, fuck off. No. That's a lot of No. 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 Get out of here. Or take a few kilowatts at most, which isn't really what it's going to be. Like, if we're being honest, it's like, this is like the big boy design. Like, we'll try and like scale it instead of like, we're going to scale it down, to like little tiny little suckers that we can place in numerous ways around the structure of the spaceship that I'm looking to design, which then gives it like that degree of extra protection because we'll layer that. And so it's like anything that's quantumly tunneling is going into the engine. You know what I mean? So it's like space and everything else, don't give a fuck. You know what I mean? Like, but see, the thing is like, because it creates a rebound effect, the expansion of space and time, which is traveling behind us, and then it cuts off. So it's like, instead of like an Albuquerque drive, we have a Lemke drive now, where it's just expanding that. But it's a small little area, but then that's tied to us, in the bell end. Right? And so, but hang on, it's not just expanding that has to make a version of, well, something has to go into that as it collapses. And ultimately it goes back to the same amount of space and time that was there, right? So that means it drags its fucking shit forward at you faster, but also when you do that and you suck some of that in, you can create a degree of interference, a much different degree of interference than you normally would have otherwise gotten. To me, it creates a version of destructive, and it creates vacuum pressure, meaning not so much pressure, but vacuum in front of you. And so it's like, then that's expanding, and it'll look like, to an outsider's perspective, we expanded, and then we disappeared in a ghostly apparition. Meanwhile, our perspective, we started traveling up as we became less dense, quotation marks, didn't though, but we traveled faster into a new pocket dimension of vacuum space, which is actually kind of what that is creating for us. And then from another person's perspective, it'll look like we didn't exist. We broke down into quantum information, and that's it. It's all just quantum information or waveguide thingies that we can't detect at all. And anyway, none of this is going on, and fuck you. And I said, wanna fucking bet which will happen? Because I'm going to say all of 3 of those are going to happen, along with a 4th, which is when we come back in, it will look like we suddenly pop in, like a tunnel, all together as one. Whereas our view, we saw the curvature of space and time, our universe, literally underneath us, as we traveled above it. In that kind of curvature, right? There's no gravity. No gravity had changed or occurred. In fact, the worst part is we had the opposite. We have that expansional. The reason why we look like we expanded is because we still have expansional. And so it's like we have to create a degree of squeeze to hold us in. We have to have more pressure. And so like my designs almost universally have, but it does depend, okay? Instead of gravity, we take an electromagnetic field and we basically just try and squeeze ourselves in to try and stop quantum tunnel events that are much more likely to happen in that kind of expansional energy area. Because it's like, for us, even though our relative perspective will seem like, our hand and everything is normal, okay? But like, it could be the size of a galaxy, the one singular cell. And it's like, that's insane, when you think about it, right? But that's also one of the reasons why it's like, I am all the places, and then I want to be right here. So it's like, okay, so we're going to dip back in there. Whoomp. Hey. which is why I tend to go with quantum thermodynamics, because pressures are often something that thermodynamics deals with and likes to talk about, versus quantum electrodynamics, which electrodynamics is really what I'm kind of using for the quantum tunnel wormhole, bare minimum wormhole. It's a real wormhole, and eventually we'll take, the space, meaning whatever we really are made out of, it will do that instead. Like, as long as you have it linked and they're consistently there, it'll take a few decades though, but it should, in theory, eventually link the space, the actual space, the stuff, right? And that's the cool part. So it's like you would basically have a real wormhole, because it still has to break you down. Just so we're clear, we're not technically breaking down, although if you went into a version that's like this, you would effectively be turned into a quantum tunnel person. I mean, and you're not reassembling anything. It already knows that's there. Okay, so like on one side, like, this is the thing, it's like these are two things that are now entangled, and they're whatever's coming in is going to entangle and then tunnel the direction of travel, kind of like a portal, right? But instead of like a portal where it's more wormhole, meaning space and like you just have to go through, this one's much more of a, because you can compress space and time, this one's much more of a, no, we're just going to turn you into a quantum tunnel, all things, basically, all the subatomics to your time and all that, and then you're going to pop out on the other side. And so it's kind of like you're getting printed on the other side for what it's worth, but you would never experience any actual loss of consciousness or anything like that. You know what I mean? But then it's also like, if you don't continue going through, you do have this other problem of, well, that part's gone. You know what I mean? That's gone. That's gone on that side. So, like right here, like you're going from bottom up. It's like that's just gone now, and so it's a little dangerous. It's what it is, but it's safer. But then it's a little dangerous because like wormholes in general take a lot of energy, but then they're also very, 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 very dangerous, which is the reason why I don't like them. You know what I mean? I prefer portals, which are typically spirals, okay, of space and time that are spiraling and creating an outward bound pressure to the given degree of pressure that the space happens to have, which is quantum vacuum pressure and so on. But then you have to link them. And so that's the entanglement of that outward bound and then inward bound, because it's a sphere. If you don't know, like, that's just a sphere that's going to spiral, and then eventually it collapses as it spins faster and faster, and then they entangle those two areas and then create a degree of connected. But the thing is like that spiral part juts forward, and you can go into it, and now you're in a pocket dimension essentially, but you're not, okay? And how would you do that, and what are the energies and all these other things? And it's like, well, we're talking about space, okay? And so we're talking about space, gravity, all this other stuff is typically what this is going to end up being, which is like why it's so dangerous, if you have to do any of that. And it's like, that's why I don't like it. Personally, I really don't. Instead of negative or positive, or taking into account any of the things that are there, it turns more into, we hit it with a laser. Yeah, we hit it with a laser. We create a massive electrostatic spin that has a huge torque value as a result, and an inward bound spin. Helical corkscrew spin, which then has a rebounding outward bound pull opposing spin for that inward bound spin. So it's like it's helicaling like this, but then this would try and helical as it's doing that. Well, no, now it's helicaling backwards, okay, as a result of that. So as it goes forward like this, we have that version going like that. And so what that does is it creates, oh, well, actually I'm trapped now where I'm at. So I'm going forward, but I'm also back where I actually am, and then that entire thing is outward bound and inward bound, which I didn't talk about that, but that's the electrostatic, and then the laser, so it goes outwards and inwards as kinetic momentum starts to occur. So it's like it's an aligning of of the momentum, and then we gain another version, and then you create a version of a portal. But not really. It's like we have this wall and this wall, which are now able to be entangled, and they'll destroy each other temporarily. They exist on the outside spin. Yeah, no. Temporarily, that and that are now spun on the outside. The information, when you remove that, collapses back, kind of like that. You have a first click as it situates where the original information was. The second click is the actual physical stuff that was there. So we're transferring the energy of E equals mc squared, or whatever E equals, to physicists, because they never agree, and I hate them. Turns into, that matter got turned into the energy sustaining it, along with absorbing energy as it goes through a degree. You get colder, you get more aligned, laminared, effectively, as you go through it, which is how I imagine Cave Johnson and their scientists and so on were making portals in Portal. Okay, because they were a version of wormhole. It's basically like a version of this. You only need to pulse it really quickly, briefly, and but it'll interfere with itself as it goes through. So it looks slow to us, but then it'll hit it like it's a big mass spread out to a given amount of energy that you happen to provide, and then like the other one, and it'll sustain itself, right? But it won't have anywhere that it'll go. But you can go in. Unlike the game, you'd be able to go in, and if that ever collapsed, you'd die. Okay, you'd die inside of there. It would collapse where that entrance, and then what was the wall, but you going in still knows it went in. And so unless you have an exact P versus P situation where you put the portal exactly right, and then you put that there, and you'd have to go backwards in time for having all of the things that were spinning and everything at that exact moment in time and all that, you would then be able to then have another one pop up, and then you'd be able to come out the other side. But it wouldn't be exactly possible, because P versus MP, for which, while I did say Heisenberg could be broken to a technicality, you would be doing that for that. Because remember, it still remembers the distance you travel with the rotation of the Earth and the orbit around our star and the orbit and all that. It's like that's basically what that's going to be. So like you'd never really actually want to go into the damn thing. They're extraordinarily dangerous. They love to collapse all the time. Like seriously. They're not like the fucking video game. They love to collapse. And then they'll pop right back up. You know what I mean? It could be a literal, femtode, Planck length of a second, or length of a distance. Planck second, Planck length, something like that. And it wouldn't matter. You would never notice. But you're never going back. You're never getting out. And oh, by the way, that's stored energy. Stored energy in that area, which will eventually come out. They're like a black hole. Like, it eventually will decay. If you ever, in any capacity, have that portal stop being there, the energy now explodes. Okay, it explodes outwards from where it originally went in. So it's like, if you were, let's say, a light year away from where you originally went in, whatever it was, well, it has gained all of the energy of all of the mass and all of the spin and all the things up to where you are now for that one light year. That it was connected to in terms of space and time. And so that collapses, and then it rushes out to where that spot was where it entered, and explodes in basically the equivalent of 100%. It's not. It's very, very close. Should be, anyways. And by should be, I mean we're talking like 99.98%. Because it has to go from and travel that information, so it takes a degree of energy from that all the way over there to all the way to here, and so it uses that. So it's 100%, but then it's not really. But anyways, it explodes outwards like a supernova or hypernova. In a rebound pressure wave, more or less. Now, that's if you ever have the portal or wormhole here stop. Ever. Like, you have to keep them alive the entire time. which is impossible. So eventually that will explode. Like the moment you create one, it's going to explode. And seeing as how, and it's not electromagnetic. No, it's like antimatter matter. Boom. There's no electromagnetics anymore. No, we're talking effectively a shower of whatever it can convert in terms of gravity, light, momentum, which is like its own version of a weird kinetic transfer, because normally you have to jiggle it and then it pushes it. Well, something to do with space and time, quantum vacuum pressure wave, that's kind of like a gravity wave, and then it pushes out whatever that is. And then there's a lot of radiation, of course, and a sudden uptick in large volumes of atoms, quarks, that stuff, which means typically it forms a star where it once was. Yeah, like an actual star. It does take a little bit, but it will form a star. You know, it's like boom, big nebula suddenly there. Where the fuck? Huh? And then it's like as it rebounds backwards. You know what I mean? So it's like there's the out and then there's the in, because there's pressure for when it comes down to space and time, quantum vacuum pressure. So it's like it's going to push against that, and then it'll go, and then that also grabs it in, and then you create the degree of a star. But it takes a while. It's not like, oh, immediately star. It's like, well, in a few million years, maybe a billion, you might have a star. You know what I mean? But it doesn't matter, because you had an exploding star from a pinpoint, effectively, which is dangerous. Okay, like it's like Big Bang shit, you know what I mean? Which isn't really Big Bang, but like the theory of inflation and blah 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 blah. Similar concept. Boom. It's like, oh yeah, no, this tiny little infant, blah 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 blah. It never moved. It just exploded. So it was at absolute zero. Well, no, obviously. Wait a second. Had no momentum. No, you know, it's just infinitely canceling. Why did it do anything, huh? 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 Fuck you! Just fuck off! So, boo! Big bang kind of stuff. You know, and so usually you don't want to be around that. From what I understand, there aren't a lot of people living around when the Big Bang happened. So anybody's clear. No super cool aliens that just survived the Big Bang, you know. You know, so moving on. But that's the reason why I talked about it, because it was like, what is that motherfucker really doing? Like, for real, like, actually. What is he doing? And it's like, I don't know. What do you mean, what are they doing? It's like, I don't know. That's the thing. It's like, I don't get it. Like, why is ChatGPT like this? It's like, oh, right, because it scanned a bunch of, you know, articles, you know, science articles, newspaper articles, studies, which are also part of the science stuff, you know, and then same thing with engineering and, you know, math, all this stuff. And so it's like, well, your collective knowledge says that this might be, apparently, with the way you word things, what it tends to think that you find to be a little bit more possible and or reasonable. It's not very creative, is what I'm trying to say. Even though there are multi-dimensions, you know, associating all this given knowledge that it had to scan in is there. It doesn't change that, like, creatively wise, you're not quite there at ChatGPT. And same thing with a lot of people. You know what I mean? No offense to PhDs, but they, you know, same thing with even people like myself that are very creative. You know, like, I don't have all of the knowledge of the math and the blah blah blah. For me, like, I'm an SMI. I'm seriously mentally ill. I have no income. I'm trying to get an SSI. I'm trying to do all these things. Please like and subscribe, by the way. This might go somewhere for me one day. I don't have any physics degrees. I don't have any PhDs. I don't have any of that. But I am extraordinarily intelligent. And it comes at a cost, because a lot of people believe that I don't actually have SMI, or I'm more capable than I am, and I'm not. And as a result, I end up getting a lot of people treating me in such a way where it's actually gaslighting, and I can't do what they believe I can do. And that's the reason why I have to deal with this, because it's like, well, this is a great idea, and I know it will work. Logically, rationally, physics-wise, all of this will work. But there is no way for me to test my theories. I'm like an Einstein to a Planck, or an Alan Turing to a government. You know what I mean? It's like, well, I have a lot of ideas when it comes down to things, but there's a lot of motherfuckers that ultimately don't like the status quo change. They don't like, the idea of challenging certain ideas and beliefs of the tribes that are currently status quo-wise believing certain things. Alright, and while I do have out there beliefs in terms of how I believe my brain could be used as a sensor and detector for figuring out information moving forward and backwards in time, and or through distance, through entanglement, and other styles of, various quantum phenomena, I'm also rational enough to go, there's still the possibility that it just interpreted it incorrectly. You know what I mean? For what it's worth, I'm always a rational enough person that goes, I could be wrong. I'd like to get there. I'd like to live long enough. I'd like to do that, to know whether or not I am or not. I'd like to be able to do this science and more with others. I'd like to go back to school, but I can't work school the same way. I can't do a job the same way others can. I don't have, time management skills that are the same as others. I really am just not the same. I have to admit that. It took me forever to admit that I have disabilities. I'm also hard of hearing. I'm not just talking about my eyesight and my mental health, which also affects, turns out, greatly how I ultimately interact with the world, and ultimately how I perceive the world, but also how my brain functions. So it's there's a lot there that's effectively with my ADHD, my PTSD. I've been diagnosed bipolar, schizoaffective, borderline, all of the things. I honestly, at this point, I don't know what I haven't been diagnosed with. You know what I mean? So it's I've got a treatment-resistant major depressive disorder with anxiety, so major anxiety and depression, that kind of thing, multiple, right? And it's that, all my life, by the way, treatment-resistant, been on all of the fucking goddamn medications and treatments. Seriously, for real. And it's right, and then, oh, by the way, then the trauma I've experienced, I've been homeless twice, I just can't function the way others do. That's just what that is. And I need help. And it's I'm not getting help. The world doesn't help people. Even when they do have it, my fucking case manager is I know you can do more, you should do more. My case manager for my clinic. I have a clinic. And then it was right, but not just that. He's not the only one that told me. Everyone tells me it's super smart. I get it. But it doesn't change that part. Being intelligent doesn't suddenly negate the very real problems that mental disorders come with. You don't get around that. Even drugs and therapies don't fully get around, and you need help. It's you're looking after your dog and your plant, and I can barely manage that. I can barely manage that with myself sometimes. You know what I mean? And so a lot of this, to me, turns into, well, I did this back in the past. I didn't record it because I was I'm likely wrong about one thing or another. I'm scared. I'm insecure. I don't feel as though I'll be right. And also, I believe that people were already listening in either the quantum way or via the fact that the government and corporations actually do listen quite a bit. They do store a lot of our data. Either in terms of what it is you look at online, or even your microphone in terms of having any of those, AIs, trying to listen to you. And so, and then there's the government who's always we're all watching, really, and so it's that other caveat here to where you suddenly realize it's well, just fucking show up. I know you're there. Like, I know, but I'm always talking about that. And it's like, then it later came out. Oh, it turns out a large amount of the thoughts that I had for studies and so on back in the Chandler house my parents had in 2010, around that, 2013 to about 2018 area, were all correct. Yeah, same thing with like the thought processes I had for various YouTubers and social media personalities I was watching at the time, where I predict what their lives would be like moving forward and their health concerns and everything else. Bingo bongo, same. I was right. I was right again. All correct. Yeah. And after a certain point, it's like, well, is that psychosis? Is this deja vu? It's like, no, I'm just really good at predicting things. But then after a certain point, it can't be predictions. There has to be an interactive profile. There, orders of magnitude, years now, in advance, day in, day out, exactingly precise, what I would think, what I would say, what I would dream, and everything else, and they would spark the memory later, or during, or just before. As I try to end my life with a bunch of quinidine. Turns out later on, I found out quinidine cancels out memories in high doses when you're in trauma. Yeah, no, they're like, well, for PTSD treatment, it can help remove those memories and make them not as, available. Right? I was undergoing a lot of trauma. My mom tried to kill herself twice. My parents and my family basically went after me. I was dealing with this never-ending of prediction after prediction being correct and correct and correct and correct, and you're obviously there, you're obviously there, you're obviously there. Posts after posts after posts online for various, random like 4chan, boards or usernames that would show up on Reddit and or Twitter that would be exactly what I would say and reference things that I was talking about in my home alone. You know what I mean? Like nobody listening in. And then eventually it's like, no, they're listening in. And so it's like, no, they're clearly there. Like you can't get around that part after a while. Like that's just being rational and logical. Like it's just fuck off. But it's like, right. But see, every single time I look at the news or even behind, any of that, it's like, obviously nobody wants that to come out. Obviously nobody really wants that to be a thing. You know what I mean? Like nobody wants a person that's that intelligent, but then has these issues. They'd rather me just fucking disappear and die. They can all lie. Constantly. It's easy enough to lie. It's not that hard. The fact of the matter is, some of that can be somewhat illegal. Although it doesn't have to be. But then they have to expose. But it's like, it's already happened to come out. A lot of this is art. Like, we're not even talking Edward Snowden. Like, that was back then. They've gotten way more when it comes down to how much they listen. Your phones, your computers, your TVs, Rokus, laptops, any of it. Like, hell, we've learned that you can track someone with Wi-Fi. You can also literally use that very same technique in a slightly different way and gain an acoustic variance and then ultimately understand what someone's saying out loud with just Wi-Fi. So it's the same thing with Bluetooth, which they don't have to ever in any way say that they're on or not when they have your phone or your computer or something. And they're like, no, we don't do that. And I'm like, how would you do that? Blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, same fucking thing. And it's like, comes out later. I was like, just look up, they can track you with Wi-Fi. Like, you can track someone with Wi-Fi. Not they, but look up, they can track, no. You can track someone with Wi-Fi. Look that up. It came up in a Hackaday, website on my feed. I was like, well, there you go. There's another one. I told you could do that back in the fucking 2010s. And it's like, they have people that are very intelligent working on this constantly. They're paid a lot of money to constantly figure out any way to basically spy on anyone around the world. Even with satellites. With using Doppler shift technology, meaning just like red and blue shifts, and then forward and backwards, and then reflective property for the amount of time on another satellite, they can then pick that up. Based upon, the Earth now becoming, which we're like, we never do that. Meanwhile, I'm like, are you kidding me? We use that in NASA satellites to basically determine where fucking the height of waves are in the ocean. Like, there's a lot more there. Wi-Fi still travels up. What, you know what I mean? Like, radio waves still travel. You know, all that, we have it on the ground. We can still use that. Knowing values of where they are, GPS, location-wise, orbital-wise, in their area. You know, all of this helps create a way to basically know where someone is. And they're like, we can't hack satellites. They come up. Oh, yeah, no, our satellites are being hacked. They can't hack Wi-Fi routers. 2018 comes around. There's this fucking guy that's like, we're going to patch all your little vulnerabilities and all these fucking... These routers. That was a good guy hack move, but it's like, that's just one motherfucker. I think no one really understands that I'm not insane on that side. And things can be done. But it's like, that was traumatizing. Everything was being stolen. They still act as if this is some big conspiracy, a cult, or there's a plan here or something. There's not. I want out. I don't want them doing this. I want help. And I can't go to anyone, that is. I can't go to anyone. There's no feds that are going to help that. There's no fucking anyone that's going to help this. I'll look insane, like I always have. Nothing changed. And I still have to deal with my ADHD. I still have to deal with my bipolar or borderline or whatever the fuck it is that they ultimately come with. Because, like, you're schizophrenic and gone through psychosis. Like, is it psychosis after a while? You know what I mean? Like, and then it's still like there's the possibility of the brain genuinely being that sensitive and being able to detect stuff. I had, chronic migraines too. So it's like, that there's the neck thing and everything else, but then it's like, right. But what if that's just like the brain amplifying a given amount of, sensation that it's receiving, and it's always giving me a migraine because it overexcites itself as a sensor or detector. Like, what's that? I don't know. I can't know. Neurologists are going to be like, my psychiatrist knows all of these physics phenomena and everything else, and like, here's a fucking goddamn antipsychotic. Get out of here. Like, I've been on all of them. They don't help. You know what I mean? Like, it's genuinely a thing. 3 to 5 different medications in all classes except for benzos and MAOIs. I've been on atypical and regular antipsychotics, first and second generations. I've been on most alternatives for cannabis and psychedelics. I've never been on the ketamine, but now, I'm also worried about that because it's like I've gone through some pretty seriously fucking crazy shit. And it's like, I just don't want to deal with it. I don't trust a lot of stuff that I see, you know what I mean? Because it's easy enough. It's easy enough to have a person just basically go like, well, you know what? I guess I'll just hire this fucker that'll get fired or whatever else, and fuck around with this given amount of medication, and, a certain amount will get to me. You know what I mean? Same thing with, like, anything else for my feeds online, which is almost always the case. There's no way they're not there. And then we know that people have enough money. We know people are in the background. You know what I mean? They're not in the public perception when it comes down to this. It's just like entertainment sectors. It's like there are editors that you don't see. There are cameramen and women, obviously. Stuff like that. And the moment you start realizing it's like, I'm not insane. I'm just very smart and intelligent, and I caught on to it. It's pretty easy for them to lie or not have enough people knowing about any one or other going on. And then they don't even know they're a part of a conspiracy. Money still exchanges, everything looks normal. They don't know. At that point, it's just a fucking CIA, like, operation. Like any other ones. It's a clandestine, but it's like, same thing. I talked about this shit in the past, and it's like, it's gotta still be there, those recordings, because they keep that. They keep the recording, you know what I mean? Like, when you're saying and talking out loud, they keep that. Somewhere. I know that. It's already come out that they keep a lot of our data. They say they delete it. So they have to have it. And then there's the hackers and everything else that eventually show up. They have to have that too. Or at least that's a witness. But who's going to fucking come out? Anyways. See ya.